Hi, this is MPC One, a music production sampler, synth, and sequencer that works both standalone as well as a controller for Akai's MPC music production software. The big news about MPC One is that it brings in a lot of the capabilities of its bigger brothers, the MPC X and the MPC Live, in a much more compact and affordable package, though with some trade-offs which I'll cover. In this video, I'll focus on what MPC One can do standalone without a computer attached to it, compare it to the MPC Live, go over its entire workflow, including all the ways that you can sample and sequence, and of course discuss the pros and cons compared to other competing products on the market. Before making this video, I asked my subscribers for questions and got over 200 of them, most of which I will attempt to answer. Let's get started. Let's start by just taking a look at the machine itself. Front and center are a 7-inch multi-touch display and 16 velocity and pressure sensitive pads. You'll mostly be navigating around the interface, pressing the buttons to get to specific screens, then using the touchscreen perhaps with one hand and changing parameters with the data dial. The data dial has plus and minus buttons. I don't end up using them a lot. I use just the dial itself. You can also double tap any parameter on the screen and change its parameter that way, so you don't have to use the data dial. You can also edit parameters using the Q-links, which work in groups of 4. More on the Q-links later on. Additional buttons are just shortcuts to various screens, so you can access a screen or a mode by hitting the menu and choosing, let's say, looper over here or sampler over here, but you've got direct access using these buttons as well, so you'd press sampler to get to the sampler screen. If you wanted to access the looper, you could either hit shift sampler or just double tap a button to get to its shift function in most cases. Regarding the pads, I'm not a great finger drummer to say the least, but they felt a little bit too rough for me compared to others I've used. I actually changed the responsiveness setting to as sensitive as possible, and that solved the issue for me. Maybe I just need to work on my finger drumming muscles. In terms of connectivity, MPC One has an SD card slot and 8-inch headphone output in the front. And on the back are stereo outputs, stereo inputs, each with dedicated level control, 5-pin MIDI in for playing the internal sounds, and 5-pin MIDI out for sequencing external gear. MPC One can also sequence modular gear with 4 physical CV outputs, which can facilitate 8 CV outputs if you use an insert cable like this one with a ring and tip separator. If you're not using the CV outputs for modular, you can't use them as audio outputs. Maybe that's a future suggestion for a firmware update if possible, or MPC 2. A USB Type B jack lets you use MPC One as a controller for the MPC software as well as an audio interface, but only when in controller mode, not when you're using it in standalone mode. A USB Type A host jack lets you connect MIDI controllers or a USB drive for additional storage. I've tested you can't currently connect a Wi-Fi dongle or Bluetooth dongle for wireless connectivity. You also can't connect another audio interface to expand the number of inputs or outputs on MPC One. I don't know if it's officially okay to use a USB hub with this, but it worked successfully with me. I used a non-powered USB hub to connect both external storage and this keyboard. Worked just fine. MPC One also has an Ethernet port for network connectivity and for things like an online connection to Splice and Ableton Link, which I tried and works really well. You can't, at least as of the current firmware, use MPC One as a controller for Ableton Live like you can in MPC X and MPC Live, but you can use it in MIDI controller mode, of course. MPC One comes with about 2 gigabytes of factory content on board and 2 gigabytes more free storage on its internal drive. I have successfully connected both 128 gigabyte external drive into the USB port and 128 gigabyte SD card. Seems to work fine. And you've got 2 gigabytes of RAM for loading up samples into your project. As of version 2.72, it doesn't stream samples from the hard drives. Okay, so the question I got asked most frequently was, is it worth it? Or in other words, how does it compare to other instruments in the category like the MC707, Deluge, Digitact, Octatrack, and so on? There's no easy answer. Overall, pound for pound, if you work with a features checklist, MPC One probably has the most options and features. The question is, what is the workflow like to access those features, which is what I'll address in the bulk of this video. Another comparison that I was asked and is easy to make is how this compares to MPC Live. The software and workflow are exactly the same. Pros for the MPC One are that it's $300 cheaper and has more buttons which lead you directly into options like sampling and editing a program, which is very useful, and that it has 8 CV outputs for controlling modular synths. The pads are also smaller, which I don't think is a disadvantage. A big pro for the MPC Live is that it has a built-in rechargeable battery, which is a really fun option. MPC Live comes with 10 gigabytes of factory content instead of 2, which is substantial and includes multi-sampled instruments like pianos, guitars, and synths. MPC Live also has room for an additional internal drive, something that doesn't exist on the One. And aside from CV, MPC Live has more connectivity options. 2 MIDI ins and 2 MIDI outs as opposed to just one of each on the MPC One, RCA phono inputs with a ground connection, and more outputs so you can route different sounds to different outputs, though it too only has a single stereo input for sampling. One last thing, and it may just be me, I tried the touchscreen on both and it seems to me like the touchscreen is just a tiny bit more responsive on the MPC One. Both have the same total voice count, which according to Akai is 64 stereo voices. Before we review everything else, I want to talk about terminology because every Groovebox or sampler uses terms differently. A project contains everything that's held in memory at any given time, all of your samples, sequences, a song or multiple songs. All of these live in a project and all are available for immediate access, as opposed to other projects which you'll need to load up from one of the drives, something that requires that you stop your music and wait for the project to load, which can take anywhere from a few seconds to more depending on the size of the samples in your project. A project is made out of sequences, which isn't such a good name if you're used to other instruments. Sequences aren't note patterns, but rather entire scenes, meaning entire groups of tracks and patterns. You should view sequences as different parts of your song, like a verse or a chorus, though you could build an entire song in a single sequence if you wanted to, because a single sequence can be up to 1,000 bars long. Inside a sequence are tracks. These can be, for example, the various instruments in your song, drums, bass, synth, pianos, vocals, and so on. There are a few types of tracks. You can see them here and we'll go over them in detail. If a track is an instrument or plug-in track, then it contains one sound typically, which you can play chromatically up and down a scale. And there are a few track options which let you host a group of sounds. So for example, all these samples exist in a single drum track. Now overall, there are two global types of tracks, MIDI tracks and audio tracks. Let's start with audio tracks. They're the simpler ones. They are strictly containers for samples. There's only one type of them. You can fill them either with one long sample or place multiple samples along their timeline. Audio tracks are always up to the length of the sequence, which is 4 bars in this case, but I've seen that you can create short repeating loops within them, though they'll always reset at the length of the sequence. So that's audio tracks. MIDI tracks can also contain samples, but they can do a lot more. I'll just hide the channel strip here so we can see a little bit more information. MIDI tracks can be either the length of the sequence or any number of beats up to the length of the sequence. You can't set them to longer than the sequence, but if you set them to fewer beats than the sequence, they will repeat polymetrically and will be reset when the sequence resets. MPC One has 6 types of MIDI programs. Drum programs will trigger different samples per pad. Plug-in tracks let you load up one of currently 3 modeled instruments. Bassline is a bass synth, electric is an electric piano model, and tube synth is a more comprehensive virtual analog synth. The next track type is instruments or key group programs. They're pretty similar to drum programs in that they're also sample-based, but they have tools that let you play samples melodically or use multi-samples, more on that later. Next up are clip programs, which are kind of like Ableton Live mini session grids. You can assign a loop to each pad and then launch loops quantized and time stretched to your beat and to other tracks. Now, I'll go over all of this in detail, of course, but the last 2 types of programs are a track for sequencing MIDI gear with this little MIDI jack here, and a CV track for sequencing modular gear. The last thing you need to know about tracks, I mentioned this earlier, they all have a sample pool. You're limited to 2 gigabytes of samples, and if I hit browse over here and sample assign, you can see these are the samples that are currently loaded up in this project. You can load up loops and one-shots. MPC One supports importing multiple format types. Once you import a file, though, it's uncompressed to, I think, 44.1 kilohertz. And I assume each sample has some overhead. So that's more or less how you should calculate the 2 gigabytes that you can store in your project. Like I said, at least not currently, it doesn't support streaming from the hard drive, though Akai have hinted at multiple occasions that that is a feature that may be coming in the future. By the way, you can load up to 8 audio tracks and 128 MIDI tracks overall, but I think only 8 plugin tracks total. And then the final bit of terminology is programs. That's the content that you load into a track, sort of like presets on other instruments. So let's dive into a little bit more detail into each of the type of tracks or programs. Drum programs lets you do actually more than just load up a sample per pad. First, you've got 8 banks of samples. So these 16 pads are really one bank, and you've got A, B, C, D, and double tap or shift tap, E, F, and G. So you can load up 128 pads into a single drum program. That's a huge advantage for the MPC One, and in terms of scope, you're not limited to just one drum program. Now, aside from loading up samples, there are quite a few sound design options for drum programs, and you access those in the Program Edit screen, which you can reach by pressing here. Let's zoom through these very quickly. Options are arranged in tabs, which you can press at the bottom of the screen. And if there are 3 dots here or a few dots here, it means you can cycle between a few screens. The Master tab has parameters that apply to all of the samples in your drum program. Things like polyphony, transposing, everything. Overall pan, level, and you can also have a single pad trigger multiple pads using the simultaneous play function, and you can assign choke groups or mute groups using this function. The Samples tab lets you chop the sample up. You can chop a sample up either using the on-screen controls or the Q-Link knobs. I'll talk about Q-Links later, but they're arranged in groups which give you access to different functions as you cycle through the groups. For example, this is sample start control all the way from coarse to fine-tune start points. There's always a Q hint at what the Q-Links are controlling, and you can long press Q-Links to see exactly what each of the 4 groups controls. Now, I won't go over all these functions. There are looping functions, reverse functions, warp functions, meaning options to change a sample's playtime without changing its pitch, or change its pitch without changing its playtime. You can pitch individual samples without affecting the other samples like we did before on the master screen. And there are a couple more really powerful options in the MPC line, the first of which is sample layers. So each sample can trigger 3 additional samples aside from the core sample. So why not, say, launch a cymbal alongside this kick? You can even set an offset between launch times. So delay one sample or have one trigger before another. And since you are technically wasting another voice for each of these samples, there's a really nice flatten function which will let you combine the samples into one single sample. Aside from that, you have a few sound design options. These all exist on a per layer basis, both panning and velocity start and ends, so you can set it so that samples aren't triggered together, but maybe one is triggered if you play lighter and another if you play harder. The filter envelope tab lets you control a dedicated filter and amp envelope per pad. You've got a few envelope types, both for the amp envelope and the filter envelope, a few modulation destinations, and also a few filter types. So all of these options here, let's just start with one. Filter cutoff and resonance. Each of these, by the way, on a per pad basis. And we obviously won't go over all of these, but these are all the filter options: low pass, high pass, band pass, and then a few models and formant filters. So quite a lot to play with here. There's also an LFO and modulation tab. There are multiple LFO types, including sample and hold, which is a random LFO, and multiple LFO destinations: pitch, filter, amp, and panning, with a mod depth for each. Again, you can control these either with the data dial or with the Q-Links. One really nice option is the layer function. So if we go back to our layered kick and delayed cymbal sample, you can set it aside to being sensitive to velocity to cycle between the samples with the delayed cymbal, or trigger randomly. Now, I got asked about this. MPC One doesn't have a probability function like you might see in other groove boxes, but this, alongside, say, with empty samples in the other 3 layers, gives you effectively probability functions of 25%, 50%, and 75%. The last sound design option for samples in a drum program is the Effects tab. You have 4 insert effects per pad and 4 sends, again, on a per pad basis. I'll talk about effects a little bit more in depth later on, but just to give you a view of the overall number of effects here, there are quite a few. They're organized by manufacturer or type, if you like, and yeah, there's quite a few to play around with here. Let's just say choose a any number of delays. Ping pong delay. I can edit the delay parameters by hitting the pencil button. These are all editable. That's my random symbol, by the way, going on there. Left and right delay times. That's just one effect. You could add, like I mentioned before, 3 additional ones. So I could add reverb. Why not? Let's go with this guy. Now these inserts, like I mentioned before, mind you, are on a per pad basis. So if I hit this pad, I can have 4 completely different insert effects or send levels. So that's it for drum programs. Let's go ahead and go into a new track and take a look at plugin programs. Currently, MPC One has 3 types of plugin programs, or basically synths. A baseline synth. Let's assign a new program to this. Now you can play these with an external keyboard. And there are a number of presets that you can load up for it in different categories as well. So let's say go for sub, sine octave. Now one little annoyance with the MPCs, notice when I press the pads, you barely hear a sound. It's actually playing a really low octave. You need to go up and down the banks to play higher octaves using the pads. So you don't have to use an external keyboard. This, by the way, is connected and powered through the USB host port. So there certainly is an inconvenience, at least in the current firmware. When you play a instrument type program, you'll need to be in the higher banks. If you go back to your drum program, then you're in bank D, you need to go back to bank A to play the different samples. The MPCs do have a notes mode, which for some reason doesn't work by double tapping this. You need to shift press notes, in which case the pads can be assigned either chromatic notes or notes in various scales and still be played while you're in bank A. There's no option though to lock the pads to this scale, so if you leave this screen and say go back to the main screen, you're back to playing the different banks chromatically. Anyway, back to plugin programs. Like I mentioned, there are quite a few presets to play with here. We obviously won't go through all of them. In terms of sound design, the synth's program edit pages are completely different than what you'd see for the drum programs, which makes sense. The baseline synth is a relatively simple synth with these options. Within the scope of this video, I don't think it makes sense to go over all of these. Let me know in the comment section if you'd like an overall sound design tutorial for these different plugins. If there's enough demand, I'll make one. Meanwhile, let's just take a brief look at the other plugins. Electric is an electric piano type engine. This too has plenty of presets to go around in different categories. Let's just pick one to see what happens. Maybe go with pad and I don't know, go here. And yeah, you can play this with, like I mentioned, with an external keyboard or with the pads chromatically. I won't go into the sound design here either. Let's just take a brief look at the program edit options here. Quite a few things to play with. These are the tabs very briefly. And then finally, let's take a look at tube synth. Again, plenty of presets to go around here in different categories. Lead, for example, and then again, you can see quite a lot to play with. Supersaw, why not? Pads are pressure sensitive, and this can impact the synth preset, of course. And here too, you're not limited to the presets. If I hit program edit, you can see all the various screens for tube synth. All right, the next type of program is keygroup programs. Keygroup programs are designed to let you play melodies with samples as opposed to synthesized instruments with plugin programs. Now, if I press Program Edit on the Keygroup programs, you'll see the tabs are very similar to those that are available on drum programs. The big deal about Keygroup programs is that, unlike drum programs that just let you use different samples for different velocity levels, Keygroup programs let you use different samples for different groups of keys. This is important because the biggest problem with playing melodies with sampled instruments as opposed to synths is that if you only use one sample, it quickly loses its original character and becomes short and chipmunky the higher you go and longer and lower quality the lower you pitch it down. Now this may be an effect you're interested in, but for more natural sounding sample-based instruments, MPC One supports the concept of multi-sampling. So if I go into the browser here and go through my samples, you can see there are plenty of samples here, each sampled at a different pitch, and when combined together into an instrument, let's say, go with this guy, depending on the quality of your multi-sample, this can be quite a few samples. So if I go ahead and load this program into this track, the end result is a piano that sounds pretty good, regardless of how high or low you play it. So the idea here is that you set different key groups which represent different ranges on the piano. So this key group, for example, represents notes between C2 and F sharp 2. And then you've got different key groups with different samples for different note ranges across the piano keyboard. Now, one of the coolest features, in my opinion, of the MPC One is that you can create your own key groups from the hardware itself. So for example, here I'm controlling Moog's Siren. It's running in through one of the inputs, which is nice, but what if I wanted to take the MPC One around with me and I didn't want to take this guy, small as it may be as well, or play it polyphonically? Well, luckily in the sampler, there's a really nice auto sample option, and I've already set this up. You can choose the sample range. We definitely want to go lower than that. Why not start with C0, then go up to say C6. And then Note Stride selects the semitone intervals from which you want to sample. Ideally, you'd sample every semitone, but that could take up a lot of space. 6 semitones is fine. You could also sample multiple velocity layers. 1 is fine for me. And then you choose other sample parameters like note length and decay. And you can determine predefined loop options. I'll just keep it at the defaults for now. Let's just make that the current program. It'll tell you how long it's going to take to finish the process. And let's just hit do it. Then go ahead and make coffee as it samples the note intervals we told it to. And I'll fast forward through this. And we now have a siren that not only can go with us, but also is polyphonic. So just so you don't think I'm cheating, I'm going to lower the volume on siren here all the way. This is our new instrument or key group program. And I can play it, like I said, not only monophonically, but also polyphonically, which I think is pretty darn cool. This actually came out quite nice. I'll be making this available on my Patreon. All right, let's move on to the fourth type of program, which is clip programs. I've loaded up a sample project here just to make things easier. The idea is pretty simple. You load up loops into clips. If I go to Program Edit, you can see the different loops that I've assigned to the pads here. You can set quantization levels, edit loops on a per pad basis if you want, trim and chop the pads, and yeah, you're off to the races, looping different samples. It's arranged currently that samples in this column will replace each other. You don't have to do it that way. And then this will launch tracks in parallel. Pretty easy stuff. So these will launch in parallel. Let's not do that. Now these live in parallel to anything else you have going on in your project. So a nice Ableton Live style session grid. These loops live in banks as well, right? So you've got quite a few banks that you could add into here and play alongside your project. Now I was asked to test out the warping algorithm. It's okay for drum style loops. So if I go ahead here, change the tempo of this project and slow it down, you can see it goes, 10 BPM down. It's okay. Let's try a different pattern. The slower you go, obviously the harder it is for it to work. But still okay for transient-based loops. Obviously going faster is easier to pull off. It does get more difficult with the melodic style tracks. You can hear the grains there being chopped up. Certainly, the slower you go, this guy as well. Okay, so that's the warping algorithm. Faster is easier, like I mentioned. Okay, let's move on to MIDI type programs. Not to be confused with MIDI type tracks. MIDI type programs send information out the MIDI out port, which I've got connected to Siren now. Now we won't hear anything unless we enable an audio track or a sampler to listen into the incoming audio. Now I've prepared a project that handles both the Siren and the O-Coast here. Setting up MIDI out isn't enough. You've got to monitor the audio coming in. I've got an audio track set up here, actually two of them, one to monitor the Siren and another to monitor the O-Coast, and I've got them set as mono inputs so I can apply different effects to each of these. Track number 1 has a reverb and track number 2 has a spring reverb. So even though there's a single stereo input in here, you can treat it sort of like two different monophonic instruments with their own signal paths. So I'll get into sequencing later on, but overall, let's just look at all the parameters that you've got to control with MIDI tracks. Ports, currently there's only one output. Remote is an option from the other MPCs to send MIDI over Wi-Fi. Here you might be able to pull that off using the Ethernet port. Let's just focus on this one option. Each program has program change if you like it, and bank change, MSB and LSB control. And of course you can choose the MIDI channel 1 of 16. And then if I head on to program edit, you've got various CC options. Now MPC One only sends single byte CCs. You can't send precision double byte MSB, LSB pairs or NPRNs, but I happen to know that CC19 controls the filter on the Siren, which is this guy. So I could open and close the filter on Siren using this control. You can automate this as well in the step sequencer. Again, we'll get to that soon, but those are pretty much the options for MIDI programs. Let's move on to CV programs. They let you send CV out of the either 4 or 8 ports if you use splitters like these. So here I've got CV1 connected to O-Coast's pitch, and I've got CV output 5 split out through here connected to its gate. So let's change that to 5. So I can now trigger the O-Coast. And again, program edit gives me simple access to each of the 8 outputs. So I've got output 2 connected to the overtones here. Let's just go and control that. I could also control these with the Q links. And you can sequence these as well. Control voltage sent out is 0 to 5 volts across all 8 channels. And you've got very fine-tuned control if you like with shift down to 0.1 volts, which is pretty good. I got asked about this. There isn't any support for S-trigs or clock, though you could create a clock sequence using automation. Okay, so we just covered all 6 MIDI types, right? Drum, plugin, instrument or key group, clip, MIDI, and CV. The next type of track is audio tracks. These, like I mentioned, are really simple containers for audio clips, either one big one or several small ones. You can configure their inputs and outputs. Currently in the hardware, obviously only output 1 and 2 work. These are relevant for cases when you use MPC One as a controller for the software version of MPC. Same goes for the inputs. You really have either inputs 1 and 2, 3 and 4 aren't relevant, though you can select individual mono inputs like we did for these two. And once we selected our inputs and outputs, let me just hide the channel strip here. You can choose to either always monitor or monitor when it's armed. This will sample whatever incoming audio is being sent to it once you hit record. And you can also edit the audio here, browse, load up samples. I need to obviously load up samples into my sample pool first. Let's just load a few of these guys in. And maybe just go for individual samples. Why not? So now we've got a few samples in the project. Then go ahead into edit audio, browse samples, and choose, let's say, this chord loop, for example. And I can chop it up, so it's not just loops. I can chop it up any way I liked. Move elements of it around if I wanted using this arrow. Okay, just take and move stuff around. Maybe repitch individual portions of the sample using warp. So I'll just say, whoops, okay, go up and down. Bring this back up. Maybe reverse a sample. Or just record vocals into it to go alongside your beat. So pretty much free reign to chop and go as you please on a timeline that's as long as your sequence. Okay, let's start up with a new project. So now that we're familiar with the different track types in MPC One, let's look at the number one thing that made MPCs so popular, and that's sampling and chopping up samples. Now, obviously, you don't have to make samples yourself. You can load up samples and loops from the factory content or any sample that you can put on the SD card or USB drives. My personal favorite when I have some free time is to sample off a radio and try and make music with that, but alas, due to copyright restrictions, I won't do that now. So I'll sample this little weird synth called softpop. Now, there are a few workflows for sampling within MPC. You can use the sampler, sample into audio tracks, or use the looper. Within the sampler, there are also a few workflows for sampling. You can either sample one long sample and chop it up, or just assign samples directly into different pads. And I got asked about this. You can set a maximum length of up to 20 minutes. Let's just settle for this for now. And I'll hook up softpop here. Now it's going to be coming in on input 1, so I'll set that. Turn it on. You can set a threshold for recording. Monitor on because we want to hear this. This is a pretty wild synth. Just hit record. And yeah, we're in business. And if you like to sample vinyl, just imagine I'm sampling R2-D2's greatest hits. Okay, that should do for now. Thank you very much. Now I could name this, of course. Yeah, let's just assign it to a pad to make things quicker. Save. Save it as well. And keep it. So now if I go into my drum group program, I've got this long sample. So I obviously don't want it to play as a long sample. The first thing I probably want to do is go ahead and edit the sample. I see levels here are pretty low. I can process it and normalize it. Now there are a few workflows for chopping up a sample and splitting up those chops into new pads. I could, for example, try threshold detection. That may or may not work based on the sample you're working with, whether it's a beat or something else. So the lower the threshold, the more samples you'll get, the higher it is, the fewer samples, and obviously this is pretty processor intensive. So it may take a while, but you could get a threshold that could work. And there are a few other options here, like just chopping it up by region or by BPM. And of course, you can always chop samples up manually if you like. You can remove and add sample points. And when you're in trim mode, the pads will let you play different portions of the sample, either the part that you've trimmed or the part before or after the part you've trimmed. Which is a nice way to quickly find the right spot. And you can pinch and zoom and move around here either with your fingers on the touchscreen or using the Q links. Remember, long press on the Q link button will tell you what each row does, and you move between the banks using the Q link button. Another way of sampling, other than using the sampler like I mentioned before, is sampling into audio tracks. We talked about that. Just hit record, press record here, and lay audio into an audio track. And then finally, the third major way for sampling is the looper. Double tap this, access it here. There are two nice things about the looper. The first is that you can set a loop length that's different from the sequence length, but is still timed to your project. And the second nice thing about it is that you can also overdub onto existing audio, just like you can with a traditional looper. So if you record into an audio track, it will just overwrite the audio that was there previously. Here you can continuously loop and record layers onto the original layer. The only workflow gripe that I have about this looper is that once you're done, you can't plug the audio loop you created directly into an audio track or into a clip program. So you can't have a workflow where you continuously loop into different tracks in your project. Rather, you need to save the loop, then load it up into an audio track, drum track, or clip program. But yeah, other than that, there's a looper in here. One little thing that I wanted to add overall regarding sampler, there is a resample option in here. So the inputs can be either the physical hardware inputs, or you can resample the audio from your project. This applies to the sampler as well. So if I tap here, choose inputs, you can sample from your project into the sampler as well, not just a looper. Another way of resampling is bouncing a track into a WAV file. So whenever you hit the options here, this little pencil next to the sequence or the track, one of the options you'll get, not for audio, but for MIDI clips, is to bounce into either a sample or into an audio track. That's a track-based function. And then there's also a sequence or scene-based function, which will let you bounce it to a sample. So you don't need to go through the process of actually resampling a track if you just want a bounce of a track into an individual sample. Okay, so now that we know about sampling and the different track or program types, let's talk about sequencing. You can sequence either by playing live into a track using the pads or an external keyboard, or step sequence using the grid or step sequencer. Same goes for automation of parameters. You can either change parameters live and record that into your sequence, or step sequence parameters. Let's go through these workflows very quickly. Before you start playing live, you need to set up timing correction or quantization. If it's on, whatever you play in will be quantized, and you can always set it to off. You can choose to record either with a metronome or without. In MPC One, you can't output the metronome to the headphone outs, unfortunately. These are here to stay compatible with the other MPCs and with the software. You'll always hear the click if you have it on. Let's just choose a drum program. I loaded this kit up here, and then just so we can see what's going on, I'll press this, hit record, press start. So that's how you record live. I could have done it with a keyboard as well. You can also tap in notes if you like. Okay. Now it's not that easy to hit the right spot on the grid. You can always zoom around, pinch and zoom. Isn't that convenient, I think, for complex sequences. You can also zoom in and move around using the Q links as well. Now this shows you all the pads in a single view. You can also press step sequence and select a pad to view its program one step at a time. This lets you also directly program velocities as well if you like. And step sequencing here is either using the on-screen or using the pads. I think where the touch screen really comes in handy is if you want to select groups of notes, you can use this sort of to just choose all of these, and then you can either nudge them around back and forth, or say transpose them if this was a melodic track, change their length if you liked. So that's pretty much how you get notes into here, either playing live or step sequencing. Automation is changing parameters over time. So for that, let's just record a note repeat over here of, say, the hi-hats. So if you're in step sequencing mode, you could see the different velocities for each pad, in this case the hi-hats, and change it if you wanted. If you're in grid mode, then you press this little arrow here, and you can see the automation for velocity across multiple tracks, and you can edit that as well. And of course, the zoom level. So I could draw the various values here. You can also move them together if you want. Let's just get this to a somewhat reasonable level. Now, if I wanted to automate different parameters, I could either live play the automation or step sequence that as well. So let's, for example, go into Program Edit here, and let's just play around with the filter. So let's move the Q links here, choose maybe a low pass filter. So to write in automation live, I turn this into write mode. And that gets recorded. Now I can view or edit that manually back here. If I tap this velocity parameter, then choose pad filter cutoff, I can see the automation over here. And you can also draw automation at the quantized resolution. You could also change these values over here in step sequencing if you liked. So go into here, pad cutoff, and edit it that way. And then another option to changing parameters other than changing their values here is just going into the automation and clicking add new here. You can choose from any number of parameters for the pad as you can see here. So let's say if I wanted to edit the filter resonance, I could add that as an automation layer here as well. Now, I was asked about automation for MIDI and CV tracks. For CV tracks, you can automate any one of the 8 CV outputs any way that you like. So again, either by going into Program Edit here, and then using the cue links, just recording this motion. Let's just do that. Go into right here, which is where we want to be. If I change this, it'll now be automated. And you can do this with a fine resolution as well if you like. Remember, using the Shift key. Drawing CV automation using the step sequencer is only at a 127 step level though. And then for MIDI sequencing tracks, for some reason, if I hit Program Edit, I don't see the automation button here, so you can't automate these with the cue links or with the data dial. But if you step ahead into the sequencer here, then they are available as automation destinations that you can draw. Okay, let's move on and talk about the cue link knobs. These are 4 endless encoders that let you control different parameters based on one of 5 modes that you can put them in by getting into the cue link edit screen over here, which is either a double tap on this or a shift tap on this. And their modes are as follows. In screen mode, their function will change based on the screen you're on. And then in project mode, you can assign them as global parameters for the entire scope of the project. In program mode, you can assign them to control different program parameters. And then you have 2 pad options, pad scene options, and pad parameter options. And if I move back to this track, in pad parameter mode, they'll control the same parameter for the 16 pads, and in pad scene mode, they'll control an individual parameter for a single pad. Now, the thing that frustrates me about the cue links is that you don't see what they do in a lot of the cases. So if I go back into the main screen here, I don't know what they do in this screen. Same goes for here. You can long press the cue link button, and you'll get an idea of what you do based on the bank you're on, and you can sort of switch a bank, press again, to see their functionality at this point. It would really be great if they somehow showed what these guys do on screen. If there isn't room, maybe perhaps when you touch them, because they are touch sensitive. Now, over time, of course, you do learn what their function is, but yeah, it's a little bit frustrating. Again, depends on whether they're in pad scene mode or screen mode. If you can see what they do visually on the screen, that it's great, then you can sort of somehow guess what's going on. But if they affect a parameter that you can't see, you can't even see how they change it, which is quite important actually in these cases. So for example, if I hold this down, it turns out I was changing swing and timing correct or shift timing, which is pretty important when you play into a sequence. And also based on their mode, sometimes clicking this button will shift up in the order of buttons, and sometimes it will shift sideways. And yeah, I think it would be best if there would be some sort of on-screen display that tells you what they do, or at the very least when you touch them, will show you what the value is and what you're changing. Another little feature request while we're here, when you're changing overall project parameters, the only way to set what they control is to go into Shift, Cue Link Edit, and then choose the parameter that they control in these menus, which can be quite daunting. So say if I wanted this knob to control a parameter, I'd need to go into here and find it. It would be great if when I went into Program Edit, I saw a parameter that I liked, I could just assign a knob to it. And if I'm not mistaken, you currently can't assign more than 1 parameter per knob. It would be nice if they could be macro knobs as well. Anyway, those are cue links. Let's move on, take a look at a few performance controls. By the way, always turn off automation, because pretty much any parameter here can be automated. Your sequence could change pretty quickly. 16 levels is pretty nice. It gives you a few functions on a per pad basis. So typically each pad will play individually, but if I hit 16 levels, then I could say play different velocities with the pads, different tunings, up to 16 tunings here, different filter cutoff positions, and a few other parameters as you see here. We already discussed the notes feature, which for plugin tracks, right, lets you immediately access both notes in a scale as well as chords. and interesting progressions in a bunch of different genres and options. Moving on down here, we saw a taste of this before as well. If I get this going. Okay. Note repeats, which you can latch and play at different intervals. This also doubles as an arpeggiator for plugin tracks. So if I hit note repeat here, you can see it has an ARP option with a bunch of, let's do latch here as well, arpeggiator options here. Yeah, I mean, it's what you typically expect from an arpeggiator, different time divisions, and different velocities. Note orders, go to here, and even a few variation options. The only con that I can mention here is that you can only have one arpeggiator going. So if you want multiple arpeggiators, you need to record that into a track, which you can. Other performance modes are mutes. So you can mute the different tracks if you like, or mute pads in a, it's a plugin program here. Let's go back into my drum track. Okay, select pad mutes. Remember I mentioned before, you need to be in the right bank to see the pads. One important feature, and that segues us nicely into creating songs on the MPC One, is that you can automate mutes. So one way of organizing a song is creating sequences with, intro, verse, chorus, and so on. We'll do that in a bit. But another way, while we're on the topic of automation, is to automate mutes as your song plays. So if we take the example of a long timeline with all this going on in multiple programs, to automate mutes, I go into track mute, then hit record and play start. And I'll be a bit excessive here, so we can mute either using the touch screen or the pads. It's good enough for the sake of this demo. And then we can replay the end result. Watch the mutes happen over here. And then the mutes are automation just like any other automation. So if I go into the grid and open this up, then you can see we have an additional automation lane. And you can go ahead and edit this so a track is either muted or not. And this is just like any other automation. So let's take a look at building a song. One way is just to put all the events on a massive timeline, and that's an option. But another is to chop up your song into sequences or scenes, like I mentioned before. So I've got 4 basic parts here in this song. Now you can perform the sequences in a mode called next sequence mode. So if I go into that here, I could press this pad to move on to part 2. Then say move on to part 3 when part 2 is over. And so on. So that's how you perform your sequences live. Another option is song mode, where you can create as many slots as you want. So let's say 4 slots here, and in slot number 1, I want to start with part 1 and then move on to part, say 2. I could choose to repeat that, say twice, move on to part 3, and then part 4. And then I could just get my song going. It'll start with part 1 in this case, move on to the next one, and so on. You can also export a song, not while it's playing, but if I hit stop here, hit export, and this will generate WAV files either of the entire mix or of separate programs. Separate from this, you can also export a project into Ableton Live. I've noticed some things don't get exported here, like clip programs. Obviously, that would be a bit complex to represent a clip, which is sort of like a session view within a larger session. And then another option in song mode is to print or convert an entire song into a new sequence. So if I do this, sequence 6 will now be a combination of the song that I put together. Let's take a look at that on the timeline. Now for this to work well, you'll need to have all the tracks in program align well across your original sequences, right? So all of these different parts will need to have the various tracks identical on a per sequence basis. In terms of overall project scope, a project can contain 32 songs, each with up to 99 steps. All right, let's move on and talk about effects. So effects on MPC One can be applied on multiple levels, all the way from pads to key groups to programs, submixes, and the master output. So we mentioned this before. Let's say that I wanted to apply an effect just to the snare here. I'll go into effects, and then I can add a reverb just to the snare. Let's go with large, why not? Okay, so that won't apply to the kick or anything else, just the snare. So let's take a deeper look at this as well. Let's maybe apply a ping pong is always nice to this pad. And then I could add another insert effect to that. Let's, add a reverb to that as well. And there are sends as well. You can set up send effects for the entire project. Now, I obviously won't go over all of these, but let's just take a look at them. Maybe sort it by type. So there are delays and reverbs. We've been scrolling through these quite a lot. Then dynamics controls, channel strip, compressors. You can see quite a few here. EQs. So a lot to choose from for sure. Vintage effects. And then you've got a nice shorthand for these effects here on the main screen. So typically you might have it in this mode where you look at the sequence track and program. But if we click on this little eye here, you can unhide the channel strip. So we could look at pad effects. Right, notice how they change here. This is what we set before. And then program effects and overall master effects. And this strip also lets you route audio to submixes. So by default, audio is routed to the program, but there are 8 submixes. You can set overall levels per track in the track mix screen, and there's a pad mix screen as well. And this is also where you set effects both for the submixes, right here, and for the returns. Then aside from the insert and send effects, the last type of effect is XY effect. Let's load up one, and you choose it here in setup, and there are quite a few options here. It's a chaos pad style effect. So here you've got sort of these loops or stutters and filter, and there are a bunch of presets here. Yeah, why not do this? Maybe try out one more. Tape stop. So I think we pretty much covered everything. You've got 5 shortcuts here to the sequencer and overall track controls. If I go into the menu here, you notice these 5 shortcuts are the same ones that appear over here. And we've pretty much covered everything except the fact that you can set pad colors if you like, and list edit. This lets you see all the events in your project and also edit them. Let's move ahead to pros and cons. On the cons side, I'll split it into hardware cons and firmware cons, meaning features that I would love to see updated, but potentially other people might want other things and Akai will have to prioritize. On the hardware side, while many of its competitors don't have this feature, just because MPC Live does, it would certainly have been nice to have a battery here. We use this to get away from a computer, and a battery means we can also get away from our desk. Obviously, you could also power this with one of those 110 or 220 volt power bricks. Further, on the hardware side, having only 2 inputs and 2 outputs is limiting, both in terms of the number of devices we can feed into MPC One to sample or as an effect processor, and the number of individual outs available for separate tracks. Perhaps this can be solved with a firmware update that will let you hook up an external audio interface, though obviously that means no longer being a fully standalone production center without add-ons. Aside from that, the hardware feels very solid. The touchscreen is excellent. The pads, while a little stiff, can be customized to be responsive in my opinion, and the shortcuts are very useful. On the software and firmware side, features that I'd like to see implemented, and Akai has been churning out quite a few updates, so there's hope for additional changes. The top things I think are missing and wish were added were a way to see what the Q-links do on screen. For more information about this, see the Q-links section using the timeline. It would also be great to set up patterns that can be used across multiple sequences. Right now you can copy and paste a pattern across multiple sequences, but if you make a change once, you'll need to duplicate that change to every sequence that uses that pattern. Now the factory sequences seem to just put everything on one long timeline. If you want to make a change in a certain place, you'll need to repeat that change everywhere else. If you're familiar with the machine workflow, I really like that you can set different patterns on a per track basis and then on a per scene basis, choose which pattern you want to use. Here you've got to copy-paste patterns across your sequences or across your timeline manually. Another thing that I think needs to be addressed, and I mentioned this before, is the fact that drum patterns get played on bank A and melodic patterns need to be played around banks C, D, or E. It would be great if there was a way to make the notes mode persistent when you play melodic tracks. Wishlist item number 4 for me is a way to change tracks without using the menus. So right now there's no shortcut to change tracks. Again, I'm stealing this idea from Machine. So say I wanted to move from this track to a different one, I'd need to find the track menu on the screen somewhere. And if it's not, say click main, go to here, and then choose a different track either with the data dial or by tapping on it. It would be nice if there was maybe just a shift shortcut so you can choose different tracks this way. Finally, one feature that a lot of people asked for is streaming from either the internal drive, USB drive, or SD card. I think 2 gigabytes of RAM is a lot to work with, but certainly competing products have the ability to stream long stems or full tracks from one of the drives. So those are my and my viewers' main cons. I mentioned a few other minor issues throughout this video, and obviously I believe all of them are important for you to know, otherwise I wouldn't have mentioned them. But all that said, within the context of what MPC One can do and its price, many of them can pretty much be classified as first world problems. The sheer amount of features in MPC One, all relatively accessible and available as a standalone sampler and sequencer, is pretty outstanding. The sampling workflow is fast. The auto sampler is a killer feature in my opinion, letting you bring in pretty much any software or hardware synth along with you in the box. And the variety of program types you've got here is something you don't get anywhere else to my knowledge in standalone hardware form. I was initially worried about the touchscreen interface because one of the things that bothers me with touchscreen interfaces is the fact that it's hard to change parameters with your finger. So say if I go into this parameter, you're sort of always blocking the parameter, and it's hard to be precise with a number. But the workflow where you tap a parameter with one hand and use the data dial or one of the cue links to change it, I think works really well. Another huge pro for the MPC One and the MPC in general is multiple levels of undo and redo. Sometimes it undoes a little bit too much, but more often than not, it's a true lifesaver, and again, yet another feature that's rare to non-existent in competing products. So all that at the price it's being sold at, which is currently around $700, plus the option to move projects to your computer to the MPC software and take them even farther using computer instruments or other computer plugins, or finish the project in your DAW, makes MPC One an extremely compelling standalone production tool. And if you want a whole bunch of electronic music production ideas, tips, and tricks, you might want to check out my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Feel free to ask me anything in the comments section below. Hit like if this was useful and ring the bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.